We can get started now. I think mostly everyone is here. Okay, so welcome to the 2021 Greater Rochester Annual Teen Book Festival. Before I introduce you to all our wonderful authors today, here are a few reminders. If you have a question for any of the authors, please write it in the chat. Please remain muted for the entire session. And this session is being recorded for people to watch it back later. So this is our world building panel, which is super exciting. World building is a critical part of any story. It's essential in order for readers to feel truly immersed in what they're reading. The specific details of the places where the characters like to go, the people around them, and all the other small but just as important details is the difference between a good book and a great one. These authors all do an amazing job of building new worlds for us to explore. So I'd love to introduce you to our wonderful guests, beginning with Rena Barron, author of the Kingdom of Soul series, as well as the Maya and the Rising Dark series. Elle, author of Wings of Ebony, I think I said it right. Kate Milford, author of many books, including the Green Glass House series, and Brittney Morris, author of Slay and the Cost of Knowing. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours now for questions. So, yes.
Thanks, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think we just have to start with the basics. How do you start world building? Where do your stories come from? Do you start with the plot, the characters, the world itself? How do you get started?
I can start first. I think it always depends on the story. I don't think there's one right way to start a story. I've had books that have started with an ideal of a world or with a character doing something. I've had a story that started with a character peering out of a window and turned into this dystopian story. So you never kind of know. But with my Maya and the Rising Dark series and Kingdom of Soul series, I knew kind of the characters and kind of the premise of what they would be going through. And then I really turned over to kind of world building because I knew it was going to be a big part of both stories. They're both, one is an epic fantasy, one is kind of a contemporary fantasy, but they both kind of span across like this huge universe. So I do a lot of world building and documents ahead of time. I use like spreadsheets. I build out political systems. I build out the structure of the cultures, the languages, the people, the styles, the clothes, all of those fun things. I like to kind of start jotting them down so I can get a big picture of what the world's like and how people interact in that world. Because some of the world building we know doesn't necessarily go into the actual book, but it informs the story and how the characters move through it.
I think for me, almost all of my story ideas start with a question. So with Slay, the question started out as, what if there was an all-Black video game, like a virtual Wakanda? And then that naturally progressed into, who would have a problem with there being an all-Black video game? And as it turns out, that question has a 50,000 word answer. So from there, I thought of the character, Kira. I knew I wanted to make her female. I knew I wanted to make her 17. And I knew I wanted to make her a game developer. And then each character I added to Kira's life kind of brought out a different part of her. And I think that really kind of lit up the story from there. So that was kind of the journey for Slay. And then a lot of the setting and the Cost of Knowing fed just the world building. It's set in Chicago very intentionally. There's a lot of talk about Black kids in Chicago being, just at a major disadvantage simply because of where they live. And so I wanted to talk a lot about what the implications of that are and what the world says the future of Black kids are. So it's early in the morning.
I think similar to Brittney and Rena really, but I think I write typically in a contemporary fantasy space. So similar to you, Brittney, I usually start not necessarily with a question, but I start with sort of what is the point of this book? Like what is the commentary or the sort of the feeling? Sometimes it's just a feeling and I don't even know exactly what the words are, or maybe it's an image, but it's like, what do I want to leave the reader with? And it really depends on the book. For my magic school series, I wanted to leave them, you know, giggling still and wanting to reread the book immediately. In my YA, I wanted to leave some readers uncomfortable. So I think it starts with me for like, what's the message? And then I build out from there from the character. So I know that's like probably the inverse of what most people do, but the character is really the heart of the story for me, and the person that I do tend to write in first person. So maybe that's part of it. But I like the reader to be able to sort of fall in love with the character and almost identify with the character in some way. And then sort of look at sort of the world around them and understand the world in a way that they didn't by walking through the shoes of that character. And what the world needs to sort of consist of and the ways that it needs to challenge this character, I think depends on sort of the message and the obstacles of what I want that character to go through. And then once I figure all that out, then I start creating like spreadsheets of like, there's a language I made up in Wings of Ebony, and, you know, all of those sorts of fun things that Rena was talking about, which is so fun. I just can't ever start there necessarily. For me, it starts with like, what is the message of the book? And then of course that changes sometimes, but that's usually where it's born for me.
I had an interesting entry for some of these, because I, about 10 years ago, started writing a website for a city that doesn't exist, purely to amuse myself, because I was between, like, I think this was back when my first book was out on submission to agents, and I was not a fun person to be around, I guess, in my house. So my husband suggested that he build me this sandbox, this website that I would build out a city and kind of play around with like the folklore and stuff in there. And that became the Nag Speak tourism website. And so then I started falling in love with this place and thinking about what characters might wander through there and what kinds of stories I could tell there. So, and the most recent one, Raconteur's Commonplace book, is a book of folklore that's mentioned in a previous book. So I had some interesting restraints because I had already mentioned certain things, and I knew that certain things could not be referenced because the character who was reading it in that other books hadn't mentioned it. And so for me, some of it comes right now because it's in this shared world from thinking about where I'd like to be in that world and what characters I'd like to revisit. But I'm one of those people that can really get into the weeds in world building, which I think it sounds like we all are. And for some of us, that's why it can't start there, because it's hard then to know, like, you know how much you need to know to make that world come alive. But, you know, again, to repeat, it can't all go in. And so sometimes it's hard deciding what to take out. Can I ask a question though, before we go on to the other one? Because I happen to have this stack of many of the books relevant here. Can Rena and Jay and Brittney, can we introduce our books real quick, just so that I can have the pleasure of like holding up your books as you're talking and showing the covers? Because
yeah, for sure. I don't actually have the Kingdom of Souls right by me, but I have the sequel, so we can introduce both. So Kingdom of Souls, and then this sequel, Reaper of Souls, is my YA debut. That's a story about a girl who's kind of born to a family of magic, but she doesn't have magic. And so to get magic, she has to trade years off of her life in order to try to stop this terrible demon king from destroying her kingdom. So it's very epic, I believe. Expands a lot of fun things like gods and this gray space between good and evil and magic and who gets to have it and who doesn't.
I can go next. I piled so many other books here because sometimes we're asked, like, what are you reading? And I was like, ooh, what are all the books I want to shout out? Mine is in the stack there somewhere. So this is mine, Wings of Ebony. Oh, thank you, Kate. And Wings of Ebony is an urban fantasy. I like to call it a contemporary fantasy, but a lot of people call it an urban fantasy. It takes place in two worlds, and sort of the narrative sort of goes back and forth between the two, following a character named Rue, who's this Black teen from an inner city community who, after her mother is murdered, is whisked away by her father, who she never knew, to his home, which is an island of magic wielders, where she's the only like half human, half god there. She's also the only person there other than her father with brown skin, and she doesn't really like him very much because she didn't know him her entire life because he abandoned her. And so it's a journey of her sort of discovering and embracing her true identity, which is also a part of her journey to protect and save her home that she left, which is where her little sister is and sort of all of her community. So it's about a girl embracing herself to come into her true power to protect her home.
And I am Brittney Morris, author of Slay, which is about 17-year-old game developer Kira Johnson, who creates a Wakanda-inspired virtual reality video game and has to duel a racist troll using duel cards based on Black culture and Black history to maintain control of the game. I'm also the author of The Cost of Knowing. Thank you. I can't believe you have both in front of you. This is amazing.
I had 2 weeks off with nothing to do but read. It was so great.
I should have made better use of my 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks too. The Cost of Knowing is about two brothers. They're Black teenagers. The oldest brother, Alex, can see into the future, and the younger brother, Isaiah, can see into the past. And everything changes when Alex sees a vision of Isaiah dying in the next few days. And so it becomes a race against time to get to the bottom of this 400-year-old family curse, confront what it means to live sandwiched between anxiety about the future and regrets about the past, and learn to be a joyful Black boy in the present. And then finally, I don't know if you have a copy of this one, but I'll just talk about it briefly. I'm the author of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales Wings of Fury, which is a sequel to the Spider-Man PS4 game and a prequel to the Miles Morales PS5 game. It is about Miles Morales learning to be the kind of Spider-Man he wants to be, instead of just following in Peter's footsteps. There's also a bit of a birdemic that takes place in New York City, courtesy of Vulture and his granddaughter Scarling. So yeah, that's my collection.
Can I butt my way in one more time? Because I feel so silly because I forgot to talk about my middle grade series, Maya in the Rising Dark. So
that's the one I have of yours. So good.
So like JL, this is a contemporary series. Some people call it urban fantasy, but I consider it contemporary. So it is a fun little story about a girl from the South Side of Chicago who discovers that her father is the guardian between our world and the mysterious dark world. And when he goes missing, she has to fight a horde of spooky creatures to rescue him.
Right, and I have these guys. If you have heard my name ever, it is because of Green Glass House. And then most recently, I have Raconteur's Commonplace book, and basically these books take place in a city called Nagspeak, which is a coastal city that is not the United States, but is like on the coast and just never belonged to it. And it's like our world, but with the weird kind of dialed up to 11. And in Green Glass House, one of the guests loans this book to Milo, the main character. And it is a book called The Raconteur's Commonplace Book, which is a book of Nagspeak folklore. And it helps in it a bunch of people who are flooded into a house pass the time by telling stories. Milo finds this fun in Green Glass House because he and his guests are snowed into a house. And so he thinks if he can get them telling stories, they'll give some clues away as to why they're there and the shenanigans that are up in his house. This book is the book of folklore he read, but it's also a novel. In the stories come together and they are puzzle pieces to solve this strange thing that's happening therein. So that's that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for showing all of your books. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Kate, that is like the dream. I got to figure out how to like tie all my books together like that, write some fairy tales and folklores and put them in another book. I'm taking notes. Like I'm learning.
It's a blessing and a curse though, because for a lot of reasons that I won't even, but it is fun because then when you fall in love with someone from, a secondary character from one book, it's like, where would they have been as, a 13-year-old or an 18-year-old, and then you can sort of like, so I do get myself into a lot of trouble that way. I think all of the professionals that run my career would be very happy if I would step outside of the world for once, just to like, take a breather, but there's just so much of it. I can, and I imagine that many of your books have the same thing where there's this, once you've built out that world, like you don't want to necessarily like just set it aside and leave it, because and every one of these books has a perfect example of it where there is a character in it that is not the main character, but that you absolutely fall in love with, and you absolutely would hands down in a second want to read the book about that character. And which actually at some point I would love to hear if that character exists in your books for you and who you would like really be super excited to write a book about? If you had nothing else to do, like what secondary character would you want to tell a whole story about?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I'd love to hear about that. Are there any secondary characters in any of your books that, given the option, no other strings attached, you would like to write their story?
I'd love to write about Kira's sister, Steph. She's one of my favorite characters that I've ever written. She doesn't take no for an answer. She's not here for the nonsense. And I'd love to write a whole book just about her story.
She sounds a lot like Rue. I think, it's funny that we're having this conversation because in the next series that I'm building, my next YA series, I'm intentionally building it so that I can do what Kate is talking about. And I've already written probably like 130,000 words of different books from in this world. And it's just such a massive puzzle. I hadn't realized like how much intention has to go into the world building of that beforehand if you want to create this. Anyway, I digress. In my magic school series though, I actually do this. So there's, in middle grade, there's actually like, it's not uncommon to have a trio. So the main character, Kiana, and my middle grade, I don't have anything to hold up because the cover hasn't been revealed or anything, but it does come out next year in May. So the main character, Kiana, has two friends. And so what I intend to do for books 2 and 3 is to have a book from those two friends, which I think is fun. If I had to pick someone in Wings of Ebony to have a book from, it would definitely be Julius. Actually, Julius and Jamal, both of the love interests, because it's a love triangle. I would just be fascinated to get a book from Jamal's like childhood growing up on the island. And then also just Julius, because him and Rue had this really dramatic, interesting high school fling. And so I'd love to just get in the weeds of that because that's fun.
That would be really fun. I would love that. I think for my middle grade series, so for Maya and the Rising Dark, it's a trio as well. It's Maya and her two friends. But Maya's also very into comic books, and she has this superhero, Oria, who she loves, and she's constantly reading and quoting and thinking about those comic books. And Oria goes on all of these really amazing adventures and fight all of these monsters from everywhere, from Earth to outer space. I would actually love to have like a series or just a book just is focused on Oria's adventures, and then maybe have Maya be a side character, kind of tagging along, because that's kind of like her dream to do adventures with Oria. For my YA series, wow, they're probably one of the bad guys. I don't want to give away too much, but like there's definitely one of the villains in the story that I think POV would add a lot of depth and a different opinion and a different side to the story that I would love to explore, because I'm all about kind of like the villain as a hero of his own story ideal. So I would love to kind of write from the villain's perspective.
That is amazing. Thank you all for sharing those awesome insights. My next question is something that we've kind of touched on already, but before I ask it, I do want to just plug that if anyone in the audience, anyone listening here, has questions for the authors, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to get them in before our time's up today. We're about halfway through our times, but my next question is something we've kind of already touched on. Obviously, all of you are incredibly talented at world building, so I'm not going to ask what the easiest part is, but I do want to know, what's the hardest part of world building? Is it like cutting down on your vast amount of ideas? Is it keeping all of the details straight so you don't contradict yourself? What's the hardest thing about building your world?
Absolutely. For me, it's deciding what to put in. I was actually having this conversation with a writing friend just yesterday. I think with world building, there's so much that just exists in our heads or in our Excel spreadsheet, right? But figuring out what needs to be in the story. And the other part of that too is you can world build for days, but I think there's something to be said about what we world build. And it's usually an intentional choice of like what we want the reader to pay attention to and like what we choose not to world build. And I think that's really book specific. So in Wings of Ebony, I made a sort of non-traditional choice so if you haven't read it, there are these two worlds. There's the Magic Island and then there's East Row, Gazan and East Row. And minor spoiler, you know, there's a very sort of on the nose experience with racism in this book. And so I made the choice, to really focus on, I wanted book one's pacing to echo the urgency of like dealing with racism. I wanted it to have this sort of, oh my goodness, it feels like her life depends on addressing this racism, because for many people it does. And so I think that required I slimmed down world building that wasn't immediately plot relevant. And so it just means that you don't get as much. You get a ton of world building in East Row. You know that the 6 on her in her address next to her door is actually really janky, and it like hangs as a 9 instead of a 6, but it's like supposed to be a 6. But the community is like so tight with the mail people that they know it's a 6, so like the mail doesn't get messed up. So you know these really deeply intricate details about her world because that's the world that's threatened in that book. And in Gazan, you don't get as much there because to do so would have cost a lot of time. And I wanted Rue to focus directly on addressing racism because I wanted the reader to feel this urgency that she feels. That was an intentional choice, but then it is a duology. So in book 2, which is 95% in Gazan, yeah, it's literally mostly in Gazan, you get a whole different experience because Rue is there now and she is fully immersed, her heart and her head, in the magical world. And I think that that's just a sort of weird out of the box approach. But I thought it was true to her character because when she was in Gazan, she was forced to be there and she didn't want to get to know the place and she didn't want to know the people. All she wanted to do was get home and protect her sister. But in book 2, you know, her focus is different. And so I think what you world build and what you give attention to is always really hard, especially when the worlds are so massive off page. You know, it's like, what do I put in? What do I leave out? So that's the hardest part for me.
I feel like my biggest struggle with world building is a lot more superficial than JL's. My thing is I'm a fast drafter, so I don't give myself any time to overthink things or else the book will never get written. So since I'm moving so fast in the initial draft, I'm just throwing information in there. I'm like, this person got on a flight to Paris at 9 a.m, and then my poor copy editor has to step in and say, you know, there's no flights at 9 a.m. out of, you know, Seattle to Paris at 9 in the morning. And I'm like, oh boy, I forgot to even check that. Or I'll just throw out street names or, you know, have the river in Chicago be in the wrong place. Just surface level logistics get me in trouble with every single draft I write. Just technically, that's my biggest issue always.
I think for me, I have a little bit of exactly what you just described, Brittney, because there is that I also try and draft really fast and just keep like plowing forward and forward and forward. And I'm just like, I can fix everything in a second draft. I've been working with the same editor for 10 years. If I turn something in that's got big chunks of like, don't know what comes here, figure it out later. Thanks. She won't freak out. And also like, yes, for copy editors, find the things that like you didn't even know to look for. But I also like, I wind up getting myself into a bunch of like paint myself into corners because of, you know, you were talking about, I think it was JL, you were talking about like the grandness of like the things you have to plan if you're planning a world that you're sharing between books. I'm a crummy planner. I only will outline if someone makes me. Like, I don't want to do any of that advanced work because I want to just sort of figure it out as I go and have kind of some of the joy of learning things along with the reader. But that means a lot of story problems and a lot of places where something I said 2 books ago would contradict this thing and I don't remember it. So I got, you know, things like that. But that's where, bless her, my editor really helps. Yeah, and copy editors, man, totally. Brittney, I wanted to ask, like, you had a ton of, in the cost of knowing, like, as I was reading that, the rules that you had to come up with governing all of that stuff. I am amazed that that wasn't a thing that was like top of mind, hard to do, because I was reading that and going, oh my God, I can picture like what must have been going on in your mind to have all of these rules governing the brother who can see forward, the brother who can see back, how far they can, what causes it, it was amazing. So if that wasn't the most challenging thing about that book, like hats off to you, because it felt flawless, which I know means like a lot of work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, that was also pretty tough. My editor carried a lot of the just interrogating what I had already put down. So she did a lot of the legwork with like editing that part. Like, of course, I made all the edits, but she was the one to say, I'm still not quite understanding how, you know, lining up Alex's ability to see the future and Isaiah's ability to see the past, how they don't quite mirror each other. Do you want them to, and why, and to what extent, and all of those great questions. So she did an amazing job of guiding me through untangling all of what I had already put on the page. So thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
I would just echo a little bit what Elle said. World building has to be kind of informed by the story, and your world building, your characters and your premise should not be sacrificed so that we can throw in a bunch of really random fun stuff about world building that isn't really relevant. And the way I was able, and I tend to have a lot and have to cut back. But the things that I tend to include for my world building directly informs the story. So within the Kingdom of Souls series, there's a lot about mythology around the gods and this ancient war between the gods and the Demon King. So a lot of that's revealed throughout the story. And maybe in book one, people don't really understand how relevant it is. But as the series continues, and as it kind of from page 1 to whatever 400, whatever it's long, it becomes very clear that those little bits and pieces that I'm revealing throughout the story that seem so irrelevant are actually tied to a bigger story. There are these interludes where the gods are talking, and they're kind of just talking to themselves, and they're kind of giving a little snippet of the history. And it all kind of comes together at the end to tell a bigger story and inform why the things that are happening in the story. So I do think ultimately, when we're thinking about what do we keep and what do we cut, you've got to become a little ruthless. And yeah, of course, we're going to leave some of our little darlings and their little small ones, just something that's special to us. But then when we're really cutting, you're going to cut the things that are not really informing the story and not helping to move the story forward and not giving a full picture of this, of what your character's going through and the whole kind of environment that they're in.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. And to kind of build on that toughness of making those decisions about your books, we have a question from somebody listening here this morning, and they want to know, have you ever read your book after it's published and then wanted to change anything?
Nothing fundamentally, like nothing hugely catastrophic, but after I finished Slay and reread it, I was like, thinking of a few more cards that I wish I had mentioned. Like, there should be a sweet potato pie card. To this day, I don't know why there's not a sweet potato pie card. Things like that. So maybe one day if there's a sequel, I'll put that in.
So yes, I basically want to recopy, edit, and line it. Like, there's just, you know, in my mind, my first published book is the worst book I'll ever write. And so I think that as I continue, like even as I look at my sequel, which is basically on to past pages now, I can look back at book one and go, oh, like later Jess would have done this differently, or I would have changed those words, or I would have moved those scenes, or I would have added this. So like, yeah, no. In fact, to appreciate my book, because I think that's something that I think as writers, we're just very hard on ourselves, like too hard on ourselves. And so on my release day, what I did to force myself to just sort of like pat myself on the back, which I don't think is a skill of mine, just can't quite reach ever. And so I always, you know, the goalpost always moves. But that day I sat down and I made myself listen to the audiobook because I couldn't like change anything or see the words, or, you know, because when you read it, like you see like the past pages in your mind. So I made myself sit and I didn't finish it that day because there was a lot happening on release day. But I listened to like 6.5 hours of it. And like, I was forced to really be like, oh my goodness, like I wrote this book. And yeah, so yes, all the time, but you know, it's just how it goes, I think.
I will admit that when Kingdom of Souls came out, I was so kind of burned out from all of the revisions and the launch that I could not look at my book for a year. I didn't go back and read it. I didn't look at it. I just needed space away from it. And maybe it's also because I was working on Maya and the Rising Dark, and that was coming out right behind it. But now I feel a lot better. I think it's the same as when we say authors need space between drafts, like between a first draft and the second draft all the way on. And I needed that space away to be able to go back and then appreciate, oh my gosh, I wrote this book. I am writing this series. And now I feel really good and very proud. But when it first came out, I was like, I just need space away from you. We have to like separate for a little bit. But yeah, it's a weird space to be in. But of course, I think ultimately we feel proud of our work, and we feel pride in it, but sometimes it does take a little bit of time to get there because like JL said, we can be so hard on ourselves.
There's also like, I've flipped through other books to confirm details and stuff like that, but I don't think I've ever sat down and read one through afterward. But I have also listened to the audiobooks, and that does give like a nice, that's a really nice ritual to have. I have listened to raconteurs with my son, who is 7, who's not quite old enough to get excited about the rest of my books, but that one he likes because there are certain of the stories that he likes. So we've listened to that, and it's a nice separation where you can sort of like it's somebody else's voice, it's somebody else's pace, and it feels different enough that it feels safe. But there's also, for me, there's that it is true, like the thing about the separation between drafts and the separation between, because there's a point, I don't know if you guys feel this, but there's always a point where like, there's the point where I hate the book, like in the middle of like draft where I hate it. And I don't know if that's because I really hate it or I just want to be working on like the next shiny thing, but like I hate it. And then by the time I've turned in that first draft, and this happened with a book I turned in last year, like I sent it to my editor and like, I don't know if this story works. Like I literally don't know what's here, but I can't look at it any longer. And I know it has a beginning, middle, and an end. So technically it qualifies as a draft. So please take it and tell me if it makes any sense and help me find the story that's there. And so I feel like there's all of these different points where like, I don't know, like, and at that point I would have been like, if I could change everything about this book that I just wrote, I would do it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of points where, it feels like the story that you've written, I don't know, you don't know if it's good, you don't know if it works, you don't know if and that stuff probably never happens. I don't know. I still, every time a book comes out, it's like, I hope somebody likes this book other than my mom. I don't know.
Well, and speaking of working on topics that maybe aren't necessarily in your area of expertise, or you're not sure if they work, what do you do when you are world building, your world needs a map, but you're not a cartographer, or your world requires like a certain fashion style, but you're not a fashion designer, or your world has a government, but you're, not the most well-studied in politics. What do you do when you're world building in an area that is just a little outside of your comfort zone? Do you have any advice for that?
My strategy is basically guess and Google. Just when you can afford it, since I like to move fast in drafting, just put something in there, put anything in there and we'll fix it later. And then if it's something that's going to be really important, then I'm going to need to build the rest of the story on that, either character development down the line or world building down the line depends on me knowing this fact and getting it right. I'll take to Google and Google as much as humanly possible. I wish I had more advice than that, but I just kind of wing it.
No, that's awesome. And also I forgot to mention when I asked my question that we have 5 minutes left. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And then maybe we could do like a little outro, like where we can find you online or what we can look forward to coming soon.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick on this question. I do a few things. So I think when I'm drafting, I'm like Brittney, I'm a fast drafter. I like to just spit it out, let it be bad, it needs to exist. But like when I'm actually revising and fine tuning the story, like before I'm ready to send it to my editor or my agent, I do a couple things. The first is I will read other books that I think, for example, if it was a map sort of situation, or if I was writing a book that involved some sort of like time at sea, I would read other books that do that really well, taking note of like, because it's like, I don't have to be an expert in it. You just have to be able to dot it enough so that it feels real. And so I will read other books that do that well, and then I will do lots of research. So in my next series, my next YA series, I am using sort of a slight veneer of like a debutante world. And so I have some experience with that, but so I'm reading I'm reading specific books that people more versed in that world have written themselves, or people in that world use as sort of like handbooks and etiquette books. And so I try to immerse myself in it and then sort of pull back, because you don't want to put too much in there. You don't want it to become academic. So yeah, I think just the reading up and seeing how other people do it well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It really is a balance between researching and kind of reading other books where folks are doing it already. And I think this kind of circles back to what we're talking about with world building as well. You don't want to overdo it. You want to put just enough in to make it real and make it seem plausible without it being, a school paper.
I hoard books. Just if I think that I'm going to need to know something, like I do a ton of research, but I also procrastinate with research. So that's the other thing where like like Brittney, I will often like stick a pin in something knowing I'll have to come back to it. And that pin is usually like in all caps. I'll come back to this later, figure out like how trigonometry relates to blah, 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 which is a real one from like this book. Having to figure out something about spherical trigonometry, which is cool, but head breaking. And so like having that in like all caps, I'll come back to this later. But I hoard books, and then I do a ton of reading, and I tend to, since I return to certain things a lot, then I've got the resource. But for me, the balance is, yes, figuring out, as Rena said, like how much to put in there and how much to leave out, but also how much research to do before I need to go back and start writing and just get the story moving again. Because that's a thing where I can derail myself totally, just going down the rabbit hole of like fun research. But then the flip side of that is sometimes that procrastination research will give me something that I didn't know I needed that was related, some interesting little detail that maybe solves a problem later. So it's this weird balance of trying to do enough, not too much, but leave a door open to find something interesting that could give me a piece I didn't know that I was missing.
Well, we are just about out of time, but thank you all of the wonderful authors for your insights, and everybody for being here. In just our last minute here, could you tell us like where can we find you online? Where can we keep up with everything new with you?
I'm on Twitter. I'm Kate Milford. I'm on Facebook, but I have been avoiding that a lot. And my website is greenglasshousebooks.com. You can also learn more about NagSpeak at nagspeak.com. The NagSpeak tourism website is still up and running.
And
I'm on Twitter. Oh,
you go on, Brittney.
Okay. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Brittney M. Morris, and you can also find me at authorbrittneymorris.com. And there's a place on my website to sign up for my newsletter, so you can stay up to date with all of my announcements.
And sorry, Rena, I saw you mute, so I was like, I guess I'll jump in. You can find me on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Clubhouse. And on Twitter, it's authorj _L, ELLE. And then on Instagram, it's authorj.L. On TikTok and Clubhouse, it's just authorjl.
And you can find me online on Twitter or Instagram. Rena the Dreamer is my username. You can also find me at renabarron.com and kingdomofsoulsbook.com. And I do have a newsletter with some fun new announcements coming up. Very exciting announcements coming up soon, so please sign up.
Thank you again so much for all the wonderful insights into world building. I know I learned a lot, so thank you so much for your time. Everybody, go find a 12 o'clock session to join. And hope you're enjoying your day at the Teen Book Festival, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.